Hey, how's Paradise Lost?
It's hard to say good, be, because
Pandemonium?
it's directly into the fiery beast of hell.
Yeah,
And
but
we just did book one today, but it's lovely to be in that space with. I started reading it by myself a few months ago, and I'm on book five now, and
nice.
it's one of those. I mean, it's one of those texts that unless you're reading it with like the footnotes and like what all the biblical references mean and what all of the like allusions to Virgil and the Odyssey, which all of which I haven't read. It's a very big undertaking, and so to have six or seven other people, some of whom who have read it before, it's sharing in the burden of that, which makes it a lot better. One of the really interesting things that came up today is how, so I in the same community, I'm also in a new class on rhetoric, and
Mm.
it's called Rhetoric as a Way of Life. And the first lecture was really fascinating, and it's less kind of theory heavy and much more kind of embodied and participatory of like, the in the classic sense of rhetoric was not just giving persuasive speeches. It was like em empowering the rhetor to live well. It was in the spirit of that. And so one kind of lens that I thought would be interesting to read Paradise Lost is through rhetoric of like how Satan makes this persuasive argument about essentially how he's, you know, in kind of a very prototypical anti-hero way, like humanizing the villain, right? And like, why he's justified in what he's doing. And what I found interesting is that there's no apparent cloak and dagger of like, what I'm trying to do is like bring justice. And yeah, it's I'm going about it in a very unjust way, but like, I have this ideal of, you know, usurping God and replacing him with a just, like, he none of that. He's like, no, I'm very clear in my intention that like I am seeking revenge for like being banished from heaven, and like, God is like, he uses all this language of like the tyranny of heaven, right? And like I mean the kingdom of God, but it's tainted with this kind of monarchical kind of framing. And we were talking a lot about like what is Milton trying to do here, like, and we kind of agreed that he's not trying for us to take Satan's side. He's not trying for us to get to the place where we're like, um, empathizing with Satan to that degree. Um, and so we were kind of just discussing like what is it he is really after here? Like, what is he trying to do? And one theory that was thrown out is like, he was writing at the time of, um, the collapse of the monarchy in England, and like he was a Republican in that time, and so a lot of like and he was also a reformist Protestant,
Mm.
and so like, at that time, like revolting against this tyranny that seemingly banished, someone out of their kingdom is like, it's very alluring to him and a lot of other people. But then, I asked the question, it's like, okay, if Satan seems kind of parallel to the cause of the Republicans, I don't think he wants his side to be associated, with the devil. So like, what is he doing there? And someone brought up how I think he's trying to make the argument that um, like religious revolt that is inspired by envy and vengefulness will ultimately not produce a better world.
Mm.
And we kind of ended on the point of like Satan, even though in Paradise Lost, as like as he rises from hell, he shrinks like in physical size until he becomes, the small serpent who tempts Eve. He he's not satisfied. Like there's something existentially like unsatisfiable about his nature. And even if he inverts the pyramid and banishes God from heaven and reigns supreme, like he's going to find another boogeyman to attach himself to. And yeah, I know you're going to ask me at some point what I've been thinking about. And I've been thinking about, just the over like the conservative um kind of issue right now with liberals overusing the term fascist and kind of the oversaturation of the term fascism. Particularly, in the case of Charlie Kirk, I've just listened to a lot of, conservatives being um, like this is the danger when you call someone who, in their eyes, is not a fascist, you put a target on their back, and that's, the literally in the bullet casing says that, right? Um, and how we're in this we're in this world where like these signifiers, these words that carry so much weight behind them, and then like people talking about the World War II consensus and how like we've banded to think of Hitler as the ultimate evil, Hitler as Satan, right? And then that creates this high alert of uh being on high alert for fascism, like all around. And how there's that issue of like the boy cried wolf issue of like overusing the term and then maybe not actually being privy to like when it actually does instantiate itself. But then there's also the other side of it, which I think conservatives are less comfortable doing right now, is like actually calling a spade a spade. And like I see conservatives like time and time again like being so uncomfortable calling what's happening in Gaza. I don't want this to get doxxed, so I'm not going to say the word, but the word that literally bodies,
Sure.
UN bodies have turned that. And so yeah, it's just a really interesting world where I feel like the ability to discern objective truth has eroded. Some people don't even believe in objective truth. Um, and it's a soup. It's a soup we're living in, and what do you do in that?
Well, those are all everything from Paradise Lost to Nazis. I mean, you can't beat that. Well, a few things. First off, um, I do think Milton is one of the great writers, and the tendency that great writers have is that instead of what they actually do in their work is instead of making their side the good guy, they actually will criticize their own work. Like it's like if what I believe is true, then I ought to be able to put it in literature and see if it sustains itself or if it falls apart or not, right? Dante is at a midlife crisis. He's in his personal life he's been going through a disaster. He's forgotten what matters, and he's the one who's going to be under Virgil, right? Like great writers like a Dostoevsky, who's going to be the smartest character in the Brothers Karamazov? Ivan Karamazov, who Dostoevsky disagrees with, and Alyosha will and sometimes be simplistic. And actually, Alyosha goes through his own fall after the Grand Inquisitor section with Radican. Great writers, platinum man the other side in their work. And I think Milton is absolutely, in a way, steel manning the sides that he disagrees with. He has also written a very important book on free speech. I can't pronounce it, it's in Latin. It's a very famous text that is defending free speech. But now we have a character who seems to be a rhetorical genius who's Satan, right? Whereas God in Paradise Lost is kind of silent, kind of culturally beside the point. He's kind of this overriding power that seems pretty tyrannical, actually, in Paradise Lost. Also, I think Milton is writing with the birth of modernity, in the birth of modernity. And one of the key, and you could argue Paradise Lost is one of the first modern texts, first modern poems. I suppose some of the plays of Keats would actually be, but he's in this. And he's in this milieu of modernity. Even in you could even get into some of the ways the poem is written. There are some trick like word plays, ways of using beat that are very modernistic, that are very unique. One would have to go into that, but it's quite remarkable. You have parts where he's describing the snake, where the rhyme scheme is like a serpent moving through the lines, actually. And that's not seen before because usually the rhyme scheme is iambic, but it's a much more villanelle, etc. So forth. He's like, well, actually, let's have a kind of the rhyme scheme reflect the movement of a snake in the text about the snake. That's a pretty remarkable move because you could say that a key flip of modernist poetry is actually really trying to make the words match the meaning to the point where it can make it look like there is no form or there is no rhyme scheme, but actually, because this is kind of the key, you create blank verse actually to make structures of verse that is more inseparable from the particular poem. Like so, for example, if we were to take T.S. Eliot, I show these fragments against these ruins, Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. So what is he doing? He's taking this entire poem of the wasteland and he's trying to restructure modernity with references, right? Like he's using references of the past. So the form of the wasteland, which is quote unquote blank verse, it is blank verse actually for the sake of having a kind of form that is inseparable from the particular poem of the wasteland. And I think that's something that a lot of people have missed with what we call blank verse. There's a way in which great poets with blank verse are actually particularist versed in a sense. They're trying to make a verse that is could only work with Paradise Lost, only work with the wasteland. Wallace Stevens is also a genius at this. And so he's writing in this, and one of the key traits I think of modernity is questioning, well, authority you don't question. That there's this idea that actually everything needs to be justified all the way down. Well, of course, and Milton is also stressing in his political views more in the direction of the freedom of speech, of the Republican, right? Well, this is going to be moving sovereignty toward the people, away from the monarch. It's going to be moving it to individuals. Well, this is kind of counter to the Bible, isn't it? This is kind of counter to also the tradition. This is counter to history. And there again, a lot of the argument of the counter enlightenment is that if there's not some part of your society that is beyond rational critique, the society will fall apart and it will become pandemonium, to allude to the castle. And that's going to be a great problem. Well, I think Milton, and again, I can't say for sure. I think Milton in Paradise Lost is wondering if his very political philosophy will result in paradise lost on earth, the loss of, in politically, a paradise loss, a loss of the, et cetera, so forth, right? And these things are going together. I know Harold Bloom thinks about, he thinks that Ahab in Moby Dick represents Milton. Obviously, we can think of Iago in Othello is another character that Milton might be bringing about in his Satan. And of course, what's beyond remarkable is that Milton is writing this blind, and I think he would walk in his garden for hours, write the lines, and then sit down and somebody would write it down for him, which is stupid, and insane. So I think Milton is a fascinating individual. My beloved, a very good friend of mine, Keenan Grant, has done a lot of work on Paradise Lost, and I always appreciate learning from him on Milton. Um, and I do think T.S. Eliot made a mistake to think that Paradise Lost wasn't very good. That was unfortunate of him. And I sometimes
He apparently didn't think anything was good in my brief, kind of
not
just
really.
secondhand learning. Yeah, he just didn't
Uh,
like anything, it seems.
I do
But his own
sometimes
work.
I do wonder sometimes if there's a bit of anxiety of influence, as Harold Bloom will say, with Paradise Lost and T.S. Eliot. But anyway, uh, obviously Eliot would cherish Dante more, but those literary debates are interesting. I think what you're saying also on rhetoric as not merely persuasion, but a certain encounter of a way of life, of a like when you, because it's interesting when you encounter someone who speaks, dare I say, differently, or has a unique way of speaking, maybe their tone, maybe their accent, maybe just what they talk about. There is something about that radically particularizes them. Like there's always this idea on how do you be unique. People are always like, "Oh, you're just a unique individual," right? Well, there is a kind of idea in the history of rhetoric that you actually can't be a unique individual without some sort of rhetorical training. And look, we learn in psychoanalysis and other fields that what makes us human seems to be language, and what seems to form the subject is language, right? And that learning, a man of letters, learning literature, learning rhetoric, literally particularizes you as a person. And it opens your capacity of thought. The limit, as Wittgenstein famously said, that the limits of my language are the limits of my world. Well, you take that seriously, your world's going to be really small if you don't train in rhetoric. And I also think, if Wittgenstein is correct, that thus the expressions of my language are the expressions of my world.
Hmm.
That my world is reflected in how I speak. And so rhetoric, I think, was also certainly tied to making an impression. I think it was tied to hospitality. Like when you encounter someone who can speak, you feel like their house is a home. You feel like their proximity is a presence. You feel like the exchanging of information is a conversation. So it's a certain training that I think is indivisible from being human. I think in a society that lacks rhetorical capacity, one should not be surprised to see the political crises that you have. I was just speaking with Javier, where basically, like you're saying with Kirk and other people, is this kind of idea that words contain entire trajectories and scripts. Like if I say something, if I say Kirk was a family man, boom, I'm in the conservative direction. If I say Kirk was a pundit, well, that might go in a less friendly direction. And if I say, he was a conservative propagandist, boom, that like those descriptions themselves contain a certain thrust to the direction of the conversation. I think Milton was very aware that freedom of speech, which he defended, was actually not possible without literary training. Why is that? Because, like I was saying with Javier, I don't know if you actually have free speech if you're stuck in the scripts that words entail themselves. Like if you can't help but go in the direction that a word projects the conversation, you may have free speech in the sense that you're not going to go to jail for saying something, but you absolutely don't have freed speech. Your speech is not freed because you're stuck in the gutters, like a bowling gutter, that words take you in. And the only way to get out of that is basically literature and training and poetry, because poetry, it destabilizes your language, so you're not as prone to get stuck going down the trajectory that a description heads you toward. Or language, the mind is naturally captured by metaphors. If I say to you, school is like a river, as I.A. Richard talks about, you won't even realize that your entire way of thinking about school will actually now be trapped within the metaphor of river. And if you're not able to get beyond it, and I start saying to you, well, AI is human, or the brain is like a computer, well, you're just going to feed right into the Nickland singularity without knowing it, right? Literary training can help you avoid that. So, first off, on this idea of calling Kirk a fascist, and that's what leads there, well, that could only do that in a society where people are trapped in words. Like if, and that would actually be downstream of the loss of literature and rhetoric in the society, right? Like if people are able to actually move beyond terms in the way that we're describing, or actually see beyond them, or use different descriptions, or not be bound in the conversation by the description people make, then if somebody called Kirk a fascist or something like that, you would actually not have the entire discourse trapped in a manner that then leads you to a place where you say, well, then we got to remove him, right? So there is also a few things to be said, although it's true that there's great danger in words. There's also a way in which we are now actually dealing with the symptoms of the loss of a literary society. The very fact that we're bound in having our thinking about a person so inframed by a description that we hear, and that we're stuck on the trajectory to the place where we do something then extreme in itself suggests a society that has lost literary skill or has lost the ability to work with language, etc., and so on, right? Because the other problem is like the reason why when conservatives say this is where you get if you call Kirk a fascist, well, go back to the Glenn Beck days with the Tea Party. Everyone was calling Obama a fascist. So what about that book on liberal fascists that came out with Goldberg, right? Like this has been going on for a very long time. And the moment you start playing this game, um, well, then no one's going to be convinced because they're going to say, what didn't y'all say it was a, because everyone's upset about the celebration of violence with Kirk, right? They're saying, how can you possibly, and it is completely monstrous. But then how many Republicans were making jokes when Nancy Pelosi's husband was attacked, right? You know, you see how it's internally consistent systems. It's all
Hmm.
internally consistent and we're all trapped. And here's the problem. Basically, when people are concerned about the language people are using, you're basically saying you should be in a different internally consistent system. That's all you could be saying if you don't have a literary society, which the problem is that's not addressing the root problem now. We're only treating symptoms. We're very far downstream a deeper problem, which is the inability to actually use words versus words use us. Use ideas versus ideas use us, as Young and Peterson has also alluded to. And so, like you're saying, I mean, also too, you see this occurring live. I was watching the All In podcast, which I do like, but I was actually quite upset with them the other day because the hypocrisy was on full display. So they were talking about, they were talking about how with Kirk he was a champion of free speech, and the left doesn't like free speech, and it's all quite terrible. And the very next segment was about the cancellation of Jimmy Kimmel, and all of them suddenly were like, "That's different. That's not the same," because his ratings were down and actually he needed to get off air. And it was so strikingly extraordinary to see that flip. Now, one of the guys, the host, said he didn't like it because it violated free speech. But the other gentlemen were saying, well, he had bad ratings, and a private decision of a company is not the same as a violation of free speech, blah, blah, blah. Ladies and gentlemen, first off, please keep this in mind. No violation of free speech is a violation of free speech. It's always shutting down a Nazi or shutting down. It's a corporate decision because of bad ratings. Nobody thinks of what they're doing as destroying free speech. They're stopping evil or stopping whatever, right? That's the trick. No one goes, you know what I'm going to do today? You know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to destroy free speech. That's what I'm going to do. No one has ever done that. And even too, like you mentioned the end of the World War II consensus, like when you look into what books the not you say, oh, the Nazis were book burning. They burned all the books they were against intelligence. No, it was particular kinds of books that they were burning that they thought were evil. They weren't burning all of the books that they thought were okay and supported Germany. They were burning the books that they believed led to the downfall of Germany that that Hitler rose to power on, right? So like this idea, like no one, here's the other key. I've never met anyone who's against all free speech in all circumstances. Like, no one gets around and says, you know what, we want to get rid of a general free speech, that no one should be allowed to speak freely ever. This is not a thing. It is always a specific free speech about a specific target, such as, fascism or Trump or so on and so forth. This is another problem. We talk about free speech too generally, like they're against free speech. No, they're against this kind of speech. When you say free speech, then that's not talking we need to not talk about violations of free speech as if free speech is this general thing that people are against. Everyone is for some speech and against others. And if you don't make that distinction, then you're able to do these mental gymnastics like they were doing in the All In podcast, where you're saying, Kirk, is you're destroying free speech by killing him, but getting rid of Kimmel is different because that's just corporate ratings or something like that, right? You're able to believe that you still believe in free speech as you do that mental gymnastics because you're okay with some speech and not others, but that's not what about, but in general, I'm okay with free speech. No, you have to be okay with all speech in all circumstances to believe in free speech. And then, of course, you say, but what about a crowded theater? And that's why Belonging Again 2.1 has like so many pages on the topic of free speech, because you have to go through the Rothbard arguments. The great book on freedom of speech is Kindly Inquisitor by Jonathan Rauch, which not enough people read. That thing is a masterpiece. I could go on. The issue is no one is against free speech in their mind. They're doing something different, right? And if you don't pay attention to that, then you're going to do these category shifts where you say, Jimmy Kimmel is bad ratings. Charlie Kirk is free speech. And in your mind, there's no contradiction in any way whatsoever. Because the problem with contradiction is you choose the categories under which the things fall, the phenomenon fall, and you just put them in different categories. Therefore, there's no contradiction, and therefore you're coherent and intellectually consistent, while the liberals are not. They're just against free speech in all circumstances, and this
Yeah.
is not good. This is not good at all. And I think it suggests we don't even know what free speech is. But this is also where, once you began the mistake of saying, I mean, this goes back to Duck Dynasty controversies or different things. When you say that private companies can fire someone for saying something, and you say, well, that's okay because they're not going to jail. Well, this is where Jonathan Rounce, here's the issue. Like, I think Christopher Hitchens said, it's not enough simply to have the freedom of speech. You also have to be able to speak freely. This is a very important thing that Hitchens was getting at. It's the idea, sure, you're not going to go to jail. Kimmel's not going to go to jail or anything. But you don't feel like you can speak freely. I mean, you already are hesitant on YouTube because you're going to get doxxed if you talk about a subject, right? So I guess we're not going to go to jail, but if they're able to, delete your platform with thousands of hours of work and all stuff, it's like you're not going to speak freely because there's a difference between legal free speech and social free speech. Okay, just because you have legal free speech, it doesn't actually matter if you don't socially have free speech, meaning you feel free to speak. But here's the issue: social free speech is up to the people to maintain. And if I'm not able to handle Kirk talking about something I don't like, or if I can't handle Democrats saying I don't like without getting mad and angry and calling them anti-American or fascist, then we can have all the legal free speech we want. We have no social free speech. And I guess what I'm getting, so these are just opening thoughts on everything, and I'll give it back to you. We lost social free speech a long time ago. All of this is now band-aids that are not going to make a difference. And we lost it between ourselves. We started to not want to hear our uncle bring politics up at Thanksgiving. We didn't like big ideas brought up in the classroom. We and our neighbor did not like disagreeing, and we made our neighbor feel stupid for saying something we disagreed, or they made us feel stupid. And so the social meaning of free speech went away because we stopped feeling free in our church to ask theological questions or with our neighbors. So we as a people haven't done the work to create the social condition where we feel free to speak. And if we're not going to do that, then everything that's happening now is downstream of that. Like, we can get mad all day about liberals calling Trump a fascist, or conservatives talking about liberals like, they're trying to destroy America, right? They're out to all of the Glenn Beck, I remember the Glenn Beck stuff like yesterday, like Barack Obama, et cetera, so forth. Like, you do that, um, you're in trouble. And if you stop all of that, but there's no social meaning of free speech, then it's not going to matter, I suppose. There are many thoughts on my mind, but the distinction between legal free speech and the social meaning of free speech is a very important distinction. We as a people have not done what we needed to do to maintain social free speech. And part of that, I think, is tied to rhetoric, to learning literature, because that allows the flexibility of thought, the flexibility of speaking necessary to maintain freed speech. So let's make that distinction between free speech and freed speech. Okay, we legally have free speech. Nobody cares, and it doesn't matter if you don't have freed speech. We don't have freed speech. We haven't done the education for it. We haven't learned the rhetoric for it. We haven't let our neighbors say what they want to say without getting in an argument with them. We haven't created churches where people can bring up questions without being demonized. So we don't have freed speech. So unless you get back a culture of freed speech, all of the debate about free speech is not going to really do anything. It's just going to be a legal category that nobody cares about. And we're simply going to, in different ways, blame the other side for speaking in a manner that led to violence, or speaking in a manner that hushes the debate to not see what's going on in the Middle East, for example, or hush people because they led to a shooting or different things like that. So it's all, so we need to go back to literature, Michael. We need to learn that literature. So thoughts, just some thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah, I really want to pick up on this social versus legal distinction with regards to speech. It made me think of de jure versus de facto segregation in America,
Yeah,
where,
yeah.
after Reconstruction, there was the passing of the 13th Amendment, banning slavery, and there was freed, emancipated black people. They were, like under legal statutes, able to have rights, able to exercise rights that they didn't have. But the de facto, the social attitudes of white people towards black people remained unchanged. And then they created this indentured servitude system of, what was it called, sharecropping. And then, you obviously had all the Jim Crow laws. And even after segregation, they would have those Gallup polls of, like, do you support interracial marriage? And it would be like the vast majority of people would say no. And I think now we're up to a point where they don't even, it's not even a poll question anymore, because it's so overwhelmingly the other way. It's like over 95% of people support interracial marriage. But point being, like, a legality is like the bare minimum.
Uh-huh.
And then after that, it's, how do I feel? Do I feel valued and respected? Do I feel free to express myself without fear of retaliation? Um, and in some areas, we've, with respect to, how we treat and how we view minorities, has drastically changed. But in some sense, we've gone the complete, like, that's kind of been almost like a disguise for, like, because liberals will often point to, like, oh, we've like made like all of these strides in these areas. Like, I went to a talk today where this female priest of the Episcopalian Church was talking about, like, the history of the ordination of women. And, until like 1994, like, the Church of England didn't have any female priests. And then,
Right.
now it's like totally different. So, like, they'll like point to that and be like, look at this like huge sea change in, in the way, in how free our society is, in how many more opportunities we've granted to people, which I'm not denying that that's true. But I think it's kind of covering up, in another sense, how we've eroded, like, the ability to have a dissenting opinion. And, a lot of people talk about, like, and this is kind of a talking point on the left too, about how speech can be violent, how, hate speech can, because people on the right will be like, oh, you liberal snowflake, like, you're just letting the words hurt you or whatever. And then liberals are like, well, look at all the authoritarian regimes that killed millions and millions of people. It started with rhetoric, right? It started with words and ideas that then became very destructive. So I think in some sense they're both right, but I think what both of them miss is the fact that, like, words are only violent in so much as you allow them to.
Hmm.
Like, you're abandoning your agency as a person if you say, as soon as I hear something that could be violent, or could be hateful, or I don't agree with, it's automatically has to get silenced. And what I think we've lost is the ability to, this goes back to conversations you're having with Aspasia and Seth. It's like the ability to tolerate anxiety, like the ability to listen to something that is so vehemently against what I believe, and realize that if Charlie Kirk is talking about how, um, children dying in schools by way of school shootings is just a consequence of the Second Amendment, which to me is, there's so many things I find wrong with that. But if I'm not able to tolerate that in my body, I will make this false equivocation of
Hmm.
him speaking
Hmm.
those words as being like directly causing what we're seeing in the world, as opposed to realizing, no, this is a much deeper problem than Charlie Kirk. This is a much deeper problem than Turning Point USA. Like, why don't we ask the more uncomfortable question is like, what drives someone to have the worldview of life doesn't matter? And so if life doesn't matter, I can justify taking the lives of others before I take the life of myself, right? Like, how does someone get there? And again, you can only really understand that if you read a book like Notes from the Underground, or you read Nietzsche, or you dwell in nihilism, or you work as a counselor with people on death row or in asylums or something. Like, and to bring it back to Paradise Lost, in your I believe is like completely spot on of like I think the most godly thing anyone can do is try and steal man who they believe is the devil, right?
Yep,
And to see,
that's right.
one thing we talked about in our discussion today is like even the Antichrist like relies on Christ. Like Satan in Milton, every single line he's preoccupied with God.
Hmm.
He's like, how do I avenge what God did to me? Like he can't stop thinking about him. And it's like so it's like even in Satan, there's and the way for a lot of people forget like Satan used to be an angel. And so it's like to sit with who you think is the enemy and to a beautiful line I heard today in the talk. They were talking about, sorry, I'm going a million places, but I'll pass it back. They were talking about the Anglican Communion, and they have this every 10 years. They have this conference where they bring all the bishops from across the world, Anglican bishops, and they have discussions. And it used to be like a lot more legislative where they'd vote on different policies and things. And this woman was recounting in 1998 the big hot button issue was homosexuality in the church. And they adopted this way of discussion called indava, which comes from the Zulu tradition. And Desmond Tutu was very big on this after apartheid. And the idea is to um, gather people, and they kind of one of their big core tenets is like a decision can't be made on any policy until everyone's opinion is heard. And so they have these discussions, very impassioned discussions on both sides. And at the end of it, they came away, and one bishop said, you know uh, our minds might have not been changed, but our hearts were
Mhm.
changed.
Mhm.
And like that's the movement of spirit that we have lost. And another thing she said is um like emphasizing someone's interests and not their position.
Hmm.
So like instead of fixating on the position someone has, going deeper into like why it is that that person has an
Yeah.
emotional investment in this. What is at stake for them if this position doesn't get upheld, right? And then you get into what someone values, and then hopefully you find common ground there. Um, but yeah, those are just some thoughts. I'll pass it back.
I mean, I think what you just said there is extremely important. Instead of like asking, what does this person believe? Asking, why do they believe it? What kind of person they must be to believe it? And like, what's in their background? Why are they invested in it? That's humanizing. You're trying to humanize them. Well, that's something literature can teach you to do. It teaches you to humanize human beings. One could argue the key, and I think this, one of the key things literature can do that other forms of art cannot do at all or as well is the internal voice, the inner voice, or going into the head of the other person. If a movie does it, it's a voiceover, it doesn't quite work. Literature can do it in a very seamless and believable way. I think this is one of the reasons why literature can be so unique at teaching empathy. And empathy is not simply the ability to sympathize with another, but to put yourself in their internally consistent system and to feel it like they do, which is ultimately impossible, like acetate limes, but not all failures are equal. And this is extremely important. Basically, all of what you are describing, or what Desmond Tutu is suggesting, is there are various things we have to do, or we actually don't want free speech. We may say we want it, but we actually do not, because all that does is give the other side a chance to speak, and we can't handle their speaking. How can you genuinely believe? Like, how can you genuinely believe that the world is better for everyone to be able to speak versus just who you think is right speak? How can you genuinely believe that? If it's you can't actually. It is not natural at all. And well, let's put it this way: you certainly can't without a whole lot of work and a whole lot of humility and a whole lot of times where you encountered, wow, I thought I was right and I was wrong. The only way you can genuinely believe it is a good thing that all voices are heard versus just your voice is if you've had times in your life when you've been surprised, where you thought was something was genuinely true and you find out it's not. You've learned something from someone that you didn't think you had anything to learn from, so you're surprised. You have felt a certain capacity grow thanks to the person you disagreed with, etc., etc., etc. Unless you have these kind of experiences, you can't actually believe. You may say it, you know the script. You know you're supposed to say free speech is good, but actually in your bones believe it, it's not possible. You won't. You won't believe that. Okay, how in the world do you have a society where the average person can have one of those experiences where they are surprised by the other and thus come to genuinely appreciate free speech as an opportunity to learn or to change in ways that you didn't even know you could do, right? It has to be a literary society. It has to be a rhetorical society. It has to be a society that trains people how to speak, how to handle encountering otherness. It has to be a society that makes this primary in its education, like primary. We don't, we haven't, and so we don't have freed speech, and so free speech is irrelevant. We don't actually care about it because we don't. It doesn't matter because we just police one another, and even though they don't go to jail for voicing their views, they're alienated in church, they're alienated at work, they lose their job, they lose their friends. So there's no it's a joke. So there's no freed speech.
Mhm.
And that's where we are. Um, you were saying something also. There's a few things. One, there's a lurking question here of how does culture change? Like how does a culture change? How does it go from no interracial marriage to now everyone supports it? I would argue that is actually strongly tied with a Dietrich McCloskey, James Hunter, etc., so forth. It culture changes in environments of freed speech and freed interaction. But that means you have to make a point to create societies where that is possible in its churches, in its schools, in its governments, etc., so forth. But that requires that we're able to handle well, this is the other thing you said, in the body, uncomfortable, anxiety, the other, hearing ideas we don't like. If theoretically you had a society where no one in their body could handle otherness, culture will not change and you will not have freed speech. And you're basically at that point doomed for stagnation in whatever that means, right? You have to be able, culture does not change unless you are able to handle hearing things you don't like. or being in situations that are different. It's almost obvious why culture changes require this, because how else is culture going to change from being what it already stably in equilibrium is than some sort of uncomfortable encounter? It almost has to be that, right?
Yeah.
This is in terms of religion, but also economics. There has to be creative destruction that makes people uncomfortable. Like wherever there is cultural change, there is some degree of a feeling people do not like, right? Well, what if you have a world where people can't handle those feelings anymore? Then you are in a very dire situation, right? Like whatever we see in the culture now when we're saying, wow, this is really bad and this is not sustainable, yeah, it's not going to get better if people can't handle this in their bodies. It can only go one way, actually. It can only go downhill, or everyone breaks off into small fascist states and isolates with people where they feel comfortable in their body, which they do precisely by avoiding otherness, right? Which then inevitably leads to world war because natural resources are not evenly distributed, et cetera, so forth. More and more, more and more, I am beginning to think that this problem of individuals not able to handle anxiety in the body is spreading around the world, and it's embedded in the technology. And I'm more and more thinking a dialectic between the Amish and the Hikikomori in Japan who can't leave their apartments. And what you're actually seeing, I think we are now seeing around the world, Hikikomori, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, in Europe, in America, they're spreading. This condition that we see in Japan, which again, I will always argue, Japan is about 50 years ahead of us because they modernized without religion quickest. They went through it like Daniel Zaruba will talk about this. Japan modernized without religion way ahead of Europe and America. So whatever you see going on in Japan today, that's where we're going. That's just what is going to occur. And the Hikikomori, um, which, when you read about them, or I've been, you study them deeply, these are basically individuals that they are so paralyzed by an unexpected phone call. They can't even talk with people at a register in a convenience store. They have to get the food delivered to them. Like they are completely paralyzed by social interaction very often, and they have to go through a rehabilitation, so on and so forth. This does not sound that different than many people in America, young kids who are on their cell phones and are nervous to death if somebody calls them instead of texts them, if they have to in person interact with someone at a Panera Bread, as Javier, to use that example. I am more and more wondering, not to, this is a giant topic, if there is something in the very internet itself that increases the probability of people being hikikomori than not. If that is the case, which I think it is, unless one has real intention not to, then this would mean the average person will increasingly be incapable in their body to handle the encounter with other people. Well, if that's the prerequisite for freed speech, and I would argue all freedoms, freedom of assembly, freed assembly, who cares if you have free assembly if you don't feel freed to assemble? Either because you are demonized for visiting those people, or because in your body you're too nervous to handle the encounter of the other person. If you have, the freedom of religion, but you don't feel freed in your religion, because I could go on all of these on these Bill of Rights, etc. Then if this is occurring, where people in the body, their nervous system, as I mentioned it with Seth, if the average person's nervous system is done for, then there is no freed anything. We may have free speech, we may have the freedom of assembly, but we're not going to be freed in ourselves to engage in these things. And so I think we need to take this problem very, very seriously. And it does seem to be part of the technology that seems to spread the condition of the hikikomori. And again, I think more people, they're not straight hikikomori, but lots and lots and lots of people on planet Earth are finding social interaction increasingly difficult. That is endemic of the technology, which, by the way, if we are incapable of interacting, then basically that benefits the AI singularity, because the only hope we've got is to have a human singularity where we're able to work together in Geopedia and all that. But if the very technology that connects us all together simultaneously makes us unable to interact with one another, which would be the ultimate Kafka joke. The thing that connects the world is what makes the world unable to relate. Then that's kind of the ultimate dark joke to the AI. Now, of course, going to Milton, at the darkest of points can't help but praise the highest of points at the same time. The death of God is God's resurrection, his ultimate victory. So this very situation that seems to be so bleak actually probably, well, it does affords possibility of extending our humanity that were never before possible in history with the social coordination mechanism. But I think we have to take very, very serious, and then I'll give it to you because I've been thinking about the Hikikomori, so I'm forcing you to think about it too. We have to take this very, very seriously because I think if we don't, then we're going to end up actually losing our ability to relate with otherness, not thinking that we would do that because we're different. And then actually we're going to be part of the problem as we may think we're not. In the same way that so many people are championing, like I'm thinking of that All In podcast, like so many people are defending free speech, not realizing that in the very next breath, they're absolutely in the movement to destroy free speech, and yet they see no contradiction. That could happen to us if we're not aware of the ways that we actually in our very bodies and nervous system become incapable of hearing and encountering otherness thanks to the very technology that better connects us with otherness. This has to be thought, and it's something that I've been thinking a lot about. But I'll pause and throw it back at you.
Yeah, no, that's lovely. I should stop writing on post-it notes because the lack of lines just incentivizes me to just be so scattered, and I'm like, where should I start?
I always use post-it notes. You see, this is
Oh
always what I
my.
have. Yeah, I always use post-it because I like that rip-off thing, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It makes you feel like you're like writing a lot more than you are. You're like, one more. Um, uh, yeah, okay. So yeah, it makes me think of the quote you often use, "Hell's locked from the inside."
Yes,
This sense that we actually create our own prisons.
yes,
Um, and you know, and then what we do is we externalize the prison that we find ourselves in of our own making to, oh, it's AI or it's social media. Like it's all of these external forces that are corrupting us. Um, and it's like, if you look back in history, at every single point there was a existential external right thing being imposed. Um, and so like that, the presence of that is not new. Um, what is what is maybe new is the proliferation of it and the ease of the accessibility to these things. Um, but that doesn't mean that there's not a pathway out of that as much as the situation looks extremely dire for a lot of people, and you may look at the Hikikomori and be like, how, are these people like so. I mean, it's interesting too because I think we're getting to a place with, if you look at a phenomenon like that, like as a as a person studying to be a therapist, it's like I may be able to give the diagnosis of like antisocial personality disorder or like anxiety disorder, like major anxiety disorder. But I don't think it's a phenomenon of like clinical mental illness.
right.
It's like it's a phenomenon of um like this kind of cultural imposition
Yes.
of fear.
Yep.
It's a fear-based, um it's not like most clinical diagnoses that have roots in trauma that is
Right.
kind of unique and specific to the person. Like this is like the cultural milieu
Exactly.
of crippling fear. Um and it's completely, I mean, it may have been like very really encountered by some of those people, but it's mainly mental. It's mainly a projected fear. The people talk about like anticipatory anxiety. It's like the feeling of like someone about to get on stage and they're worried that they're going to forget their lines and people are going to laugh at them. It's
Yeah.
like it's like
Yeah, yeah,
having that
yeah.
it's like having that in your mind all of the time. Like to go to the grocery store is like
Hmm.
you're going on stage in front of 70,000 people. Um and I've had moments in my life where I was uh quite depressed and quite anxious where that was the truth. And I dated someone who literally she told me she was like scared to go to the grocery store. Like I would pick like her groceries up a lot of the times. And that was not that abnormal in a college campus. And this was well, I guess that was after COVID, but I was gonna say that the pandemic certainly accelerated that for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
Even, even like my mom, she's like kind of like a hybrid, she's like a kind of a hybrid job where she can work from home as much as she'd like. But her office is literally walking distance from her. And she was saying like she was like I want to go back to the office. Like a part of me like really wants to have that in-person interaction and really feel, the energy and the vibe because she talks about like the place she works at. She's like, I love the vibe. And I'm like, wouldn't you want to experience that in person? And she's like, yeah, but like every time I go to the office, like I get so anxious and like I don't have like my designated spot and like, I like can't think well and and she's gotten to the place I've helped her get there where it's like if you don't go enough, because she'll go like once and then she won't go for another month. It's like, of course, every subsequent time you go, you're not going to feel at home because you haven't gotten past the initial kind of growing pains to get to a place of like feeling like rooted and like you know your role. You have developed relationships with people, so it's like it's kind of the irony of like watching something like the Hakimori, and not to diminish at all the experience. Like I've said,
Sure.
I've dealt with similar things. It's like the the window of time to get from like literally not being able to leave your room to being like socially competent, and not just competent, but like actually seeking out social interaction is actually not that long.
No,
Like
no.
if like I mean you've heard countless like people giving TED Talks where they're like, I couldn't imagine myself doing this a year ago. And it's like little by little, I did mock trial in college. I was my first ever mock trial tournament, we went up against Stanford's A team. And I had been doing mock trial for like 2 weeks at that point. And I almost puked in the bathroom. Like I was terrified. And it was not great. Like, I didn't like have some like, cataclysmic forgetting of lines and stuff, but I I like my brain felt like, kind of on the verge of like overstimulation the whole time. And by my fourth year, I won all regional attorney and like top overall attorney, and I felt like worlds more competent and smart. And like part of that was just learning the craft and everything, but part of it was just putting myself in those situations time and time again. And the anxiety doesn't completely go away, but it becomes less existential, I think.
Hmm.
It's no longer what is everyone going to think of me? I'm going to make an absolute buffoon of myself and all these things. To no, this is a sensation in my body, but it's not going to overwhelm me. I have techniques of keeping that at bay and really being able to focus and center in on what I have to do. And um, it's it's tragic in a way, but I think it's also, I mean, it's tragic to say like it's not a mental illness, it's caused by these cultural forces, but there's also liberation in that because if it was a clinical mental illness, there's actually a degree to which you can't do that much. But if it's entirely like a cultural phenomenon, if you if you wake people up to the the reality of like what it can be to experience the world and like the world is not there are scary elements of the world and the parts of the world are getting scarier every day but there's also great beauty in the world and you know we talk about beauty all the time and like the beauty of the encounter and the surprise and you know, being tempted by the good, actually not just being able to be social, like being able to perform sociality, but actually I reached out to you and was just like, I want to talk because I'm tempted by discussion and like where that can lead. And like that wasn't innate for me. You know, I don't think that was innate for many of us. Um, and we all probably had people in our lives who were able to facilitate that encounter. So all I'm saying is like it's something that can be demonstrated and it's something that can be taught and it's um something that can be learned.
I'll say I really like how you put that's very useful with the hikikomori as kind of a constant stage fright. I think that's absolutely getting at it, and that's very useful. I also think so. I think what we're seeing is that socialization, if you will, is a habit. It's a muscle. It's not something you just can do. You actually have to train it. You could argue that for most of history, because you didn't have technology where you could order food without leaving your room, you were just going to train this muscle. You kind of had to survive. But now, if you don't have to, you don't, or if you rationally don't. Rationality has you ration it's rational to end up a hikikomori, or you could argue there's no reason. I mean, it saves time. You know you're not going to die. You're happy. I mean, there's a way in which it's so interesting because there's something about the hikikomori. Isn't that kind of like the enlightenment dream to be detached from the world and you don't need other people and you're satisfied by yourself? Isn't that kind of like enlightenment or something like that? And it's just very interesting because it really matters, I suppose, how you get to enlightenment. Do you get it through the social or by avoiding the social, you know? And then I think you see in that limits of detachment, right? Because I mean, it's interesting because obviously, if we're just taking a kind of a very popular understanding, a simplistic understanding of Buddhism, there's this idea of detachment being enlightenment, et cetera, so forth. Well, that was in a world where the only way to be detached was to interact with other people, or you didn't have the technology to order food without leaving. Like, so you are going to be attached, and then detaching would be the road to enlightenment, because that would be kind of the Hegelian negation. But what if it's detachment to detachment? That doesn't seem so good, right? So it really matters. Detachment perhaps only has some sort of enlightenment potential if it's through attachment and in attachment and through the social. Because it has to be through some sort of crucible. It has to be through some sort of difficulty and challenge. If you don't do that, it's very, very different. So I'm always kind of interested with the Hikikomori, comparing them with enlightenment ideals and the difference there. It's very interesting. Um, and then of course I nevertheless have issues with the guru who separates from the society, even though that is arguably better, but it's not what will be sufficient for our new address, as we talk about in belonging again. But we'd have to go into that. Um, I think we see socialization as a habit, like I was saying, that we don't necessarily train. And if we don't train it, as our technological environment now gives us the option not to, then we don't. And then at that point, it becomes rational to not be social because it is terrifying, right? Therefore, you should stay at home. And if you're happy at home or you're okay at home, then why not? Also, there are many old people in Japan who become hikikomori. They weren't, and then they become it.
Mm.
Well, that means it's cultural, and I think you're right. It is a cultural thing, and I do think Japan has it in particular because it's a shame culture, not a guilt culture, which is a difference in the literature. And basically, in Japan, if you don't get a job, you're seen as basically worthless. Like in Japan, there's a real emphasis on a successful job and et cetera, so forth. And if the economy in Japan has stagnated for 3 decades and it's really hard to get a job, then that mixture of factors makes Japan perhaps uniquely susceptible to the Hikikomori phenomenon, but it is absolutely spreading. And the very fact that older people can fall into it, I think we see that in the West all the time. People, they become isolated as older people. Their kids have moved away, the church has fallen apart, and they become very isolated. And you get into those habits. I think it is a mistake to think like cell phone addiction, hikikomori, these are all young people things. There are many older people addicted to their phones. There are many older people that become hikikomori. And it's very difficult to get out of it because you start to experience everything as constant stage fright. The reason why I emphasize that is because it means socialization is a muscle. And if you do not train it, you will lose it. You could have it and then lose it. You may never get it. You could, but then the hope is the fact that if you don't have it, you can regain it. You can start going to the gym. Socialization is something that has to be trained, and if we don't train it, there's issues. I think another reason why I very much like the metaphor of the Hikimura as constant stage fright is because this phenomenon, I definitely think this inability to socialize. And I'm glad you brought up what you were saying on colleges where can't even go to the grocery store. That's what I'm saying. Like this spirit of the hikikomori is spreading. It's very widespread. People can't even go to the grocery store. It's just most pronounced in Japanese men in particular, but there are all women as well that are increasingly falling into this. Um, so it's a wider thing. One of the reasons why I think it's important to identify this kind of constant stage fright feeling that people have is that in a world, I do think it's connected with the loss of givens that we talk about all the time with belonging again.
Mm.
Because
Hmm.
when you don't have givens, then it doesn't feel like you know what to do. It all feels like a performance. It all feels like acting. It's not clear what's real and what's not. So it all feels like a performance and you don't know the rules. Under Gibbons, in a sense, it was still a performance, but you just knew what to do and everyone knew their lines and you didn't have to worry about it so much. Now, under pluralism with the loss of Gibbons, it really feels like it's always a certain improv acting. It always feels like a performance. And you don't know what to do. And what if something goes wrong or they get upset? So there's a way in which the loss of Gibbons opens up this kind of feeling of performativity that I think sweeps across the world. And Javier obviously is speaking about the philosophy of acting. The reason why I point
Hmm.
this out is because actually there's a way in which the Hikikomori, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which I'm easily not, there's almost a way in which they're just kind of the most honest or the most kind of they're just the most strong manifestation of this reality. They experience everything as a stage, everything is a performance, and they have constant stage fright. Well, yes, without Givens, everything is a performance. Everything is a certain improv performance, and the Hikikomori are just like, forget it. It's too much. I don't want to do it. Well, here's the funny thing. It goes back to what you were saying on rhetoric. Rhetoric education basically was saying, hey, every time you go into a social interaction, it actually is a kind of performance. It really matters if you can speak well. It really matters how you hold yourself up. Why did we have manners? Why was it polite? It's like they're really in the classic literature. If I say in older literature, they were like, hey, guess what? Social interactions are a performance. You are performing. And there's a funny way in which we have now in which the Hikikomori is just a kind of return to that understanding that socialization is a performance. And whereas rhetoric trained it, now we're just kind of realizing a truth that I think rhetorical education acknowledged, but without the rhetorical education. So it's the worst of both worlds. Like you're having to experience everything as a performance, but you don't have the education to know how to perform, ergo it's constant stage fright. And
Mm.
what ended up happening is in the past, I will say this, in the past, rhetoric did tend to serve the elites more so, right? But elites, here's the funny thing, like the elite class had more of a kind of understanding that you have to perform your roles. One could think of distinctions by Pierre Bourdieu, this notion that you have to show that you're elite. And I was part of the Jefferson Society and have been reading on the history of literary and debating societies. And there was this idea that if you're the elite, then you should communicate that and how you speak and how you talk and et cetera and so forth. And the reason why is because the status of being elite was absolutely arbitrary. And so you had to make it, it was completely a performance. It was something that was socially created for class creation, right? So there was this understanding of the need to perform. In a funny way, in a world without givens, basically everyone requires an elite education now. Everyone actually is in the boat of kind of this social experience of things, similarly to what most elites in history experience the society as, right? And I'm not saying that rhetorical education was just for the elites. I'm just saying that there has actually in history often been, the elites have often more understood the need for rhetoric, actually, and the ability to sort of act a certain way socially in order to communicate and to make the most of the social interactions. Because you could also argue that one of the things that make the elites is they understand the importance of networks and social capital. Like they really understand that that's actually the difference between success and not hard work. It's actually going to ultimately be who you know. Hard work matters, and also risk taking matters, but social networks really matter. So there was this idea of learning how to perform to make the most of your social interactions. That way of thinking, in a very weird way, with the loss of givens, actually kind of unveils the average person to experiencing social interactions as requiring a certain performativity that you have to be able to do well. And we don't have an elite education. Certainly not the same of the aristocratic education. We don't have the rhetorical education. An elite education means you get education that will have you a high paying job, meaning technical knowledge, meaning you get the degree and et cetera and so forth. That's not the education that gets you the highest paying job, and then we call you elite because you have the highest paying job, is not the same as all as the education in the past that was trying to make people elite in their very way of acting to communicate distinction as it came forth. That's a very different form of elite making. And the education of rhetoric actually now more than ever, because I'll close the point with this and then give it back to you. You could argue the most elite, ergo advanced, sociological condition, ergo the most difficult to handle and to navigate, is the loss of givens. That is the most level high difficulty to handle, right? In that environment, it's the final boss. Yes, absolutely. In that environment, an elite education is not a nicety, it's a necessity, right? If you and that elite education is not to be elite education as we now understand it, which is getting a high paying job, but as was classically understood of you must learn how to carry yourself in a certain way to navigate complicated social waters. Let me say this to make the point clearer. Elites experienced the social as complex waters that had to be navigated, and there was an education to help you do that. Now everyone experiences the social as complex waters to navigate. And so an education that's more like what was classically given for people to navigate complex social waters is what people need today. If they do not get that, then it would make sense why they experience a constant stage fright. Because they know they know to socialize is to quote unquote perform and to be on stage, and they don't know their lines. They don't know who's watching. They don't know what to do. So they have constant stage fright. And so we have a radical mismatch of education. And then if you have that constant stage fright, you don't want free speech. You don't want? You don't want free speech, certainly, because that's just more lines people could throw at you, right? Like if speech is free, at least if there's a containment of lines and you don't know the lines, there's a higher chance you know what to say. Oh, good. Okay, I know what to say. But if you had freed speech where people could say anything, the chances of you knowing what to say in these social environments is like zero. And you already have stage fright and you're already experiencing speech in a way that makes you nervous. And then they say something that makes you uncomfortable and then you blow up. You're already in it. Let me put it this way. You are already today in a orientation to experience any speech as uncomfortable. Even speech you agree with. And then someone says speech you don't agree with. Well, you're done. Like we are already conditioned to not be able to handle speech in general. Like people are, let me put it this way. You know how everyone's saying we have to be comfortable with speech we don't agree with? The problem with that phrase, it suggests that people are comfortable with speech they agree with. I would argue people are actually not even comfortable now with speech they agree with because they're not comfortable with speaking. That is how weak our nervous systems have become. It just blows up when we see speech we disagree with, but there's a deeper problem. We can't even handle speaking. We're nervous interacting with our neighbors. So it's a mistake to overemphasize that the problem is that we can't handle speaking we disagree with. Although that's true, there's a deeper problem going on. We don't have the nervous system to handle freaking speaking. So there's something downstream we've got to work on, which I think is going to be tied to a rhetorical education. But I will pause and throw it back to you. So I think there's these deeper issues.
Yeah, the lack of givens creates a world where there's fewer and fewer commonalities and common ground between people, but also there's fewer and fewer if we're going to play with the stage fright analogy, there's fewer and fewer stages for us to go to gather with people
Yes.
around a common not necessarily like a common like activity or like I'm not just talking about like oh there's less like sports teams to join or something, but like there's less arenas where there's a common goal or a common project which can help instrumentally if you are working on something together to naturally have dialogue that comes out of that because you're already in the flow of this like third thing that you're jointly, putting your attention on. Like I remember Chris Williamson, the podcaster, he shared a little while ago that in Australia, they were trying all these different things to build relationality with men. And they kept realizing that like what works for women does not work for men. Like the kind of dialogue group kind of
Right.
framing like just it doesn't work for most men. And so what they found that works is if you get a bunch of men together and they build something or they repair something, that there's a natural outgrowth of connection that comes from that. So there's a group called like they like repair she sheds and
Nice.
but then they also get together and have coffee after or something and talk about their lives. Um and so with the loss of like those opportunities as well, and that's not incentivized, parents aren't like incentivizing their kids to volunteer to serve in their community to um people are left having to improvise their entire social life and build it up from scratch, and I can relate to that. um but not just is that the case, because I think even in that space, if you have the kind of come from of like I do actually want to build a network of not just like in the business sense, like, oh, I want to get my
Yeah.
LinkedIn numbers up, but like I want to build a community. Um, you you at least like that you at least like are open to the fact of like buying a boat and navigating those social waters, right? But for a growing number of people, the appeal of that has not been um experienced by them, and it has not been articulated to them by anybody. And so then they're left being like, what is in it for me? Like what how could this possibly serve me in the future. And then they recoil, they retreat. Um, it was funny you got to the place where you were talking about like aristocratic societies and how with kind of conventions of manners and ritual and societal roles, they they actually promote this type of life. I was thinking about how with the loss of givens, particularly religion, um, and kind of the general aversion of like a lot of like millennial parents to force their kids to do things, to have things that are compulsive. You also don't have these like, all the things that every kid dreads. Their parents being like, we are going to go to our family friend's house and we're going to have dinner. Um, not because we necessarily like love these people or oftentimes it's like the scenario of like the parents love the other parents but like the kids don't get along type thing and I feel like I was at the tail end of that being like still important, and I can only see it now as important. Back then it was like often something I dreaded, and it wasn't like I always like even enjoyed that time, but it's like the fact that I was forced to realize like what I didn't enjoy about it was more of a teacher than if I just spent the night at home. You know what I mean? Because it's like, yeah, there was something about this, the way that the parents were acting and the kids were acting that didn't feel welcoming or inviting or whatever. It's like that's still communicating to me what I value and how I can attempt to be that to not have people that I invite to my house feel like that. And so I think there's also this like this loss of like compulsive social interactions as kids. Church is another one where most kids, teenagers, it's like the thing that they dread the most is going to church. Um, and like if you as a parent can like I've seen it in churches that I go to with parents with kids that are teenagers, and I talk to the parents and they're like, yeah, like maybe they're not like outwardly rebelling against the church, but like they're like they don't really have much interest. Like there's not that many kids their age. When they do like the children's circle, it's like it's all babies and them, it's like there's not really much in it for them and they're not like really interested. God seems so abstract and esoteric and but like and I'll tell them and they'll I mean admit to me too. It's like the fact that they are constantly showing up and like I'm not holding their hand. Like when we go to coffee hour, like they're left alone and I'm trying to get them to like talk to people and be comfortable encountering the otherness of their church and like to serve the church and to like actually have something to like serve um are extremely important things to teach. And like in an era where I mean fewer and fewer people are going to church, but also parents want don't want to be seen as the authoritarian parent to their kids who are like forcing them to do all these things that they don't want to do, right? um they want to just make them happy and like respond to their will, and it's like if you've been around a teenager, if you bend to their will, I don't think you'd want to see that picture play out. um but then and I'll pass it back to you, but then the interesting thing is like how do we promote this and adhere to this traditional elite form of education without it also including all of the things about that style that are now considered taboo and out of fashion, like the strict societal rules, the hierarchical, what's the word I'm looking patriarchal, like all the things that caused Prince Harry and Meghan Markle to leave the royal family, whether or not you agree with their decision, like you have to take seriously, what they were feeling and like what compelled them to do that. Um, how do we do that in a 21st century way? And I think everything that you talk about in Belonging Again with like encountering difference and living in a pluralistic society and not being consumed by the terror of that, but actually encountering it and um, uh, you know, being able to stand in conviction with your own opinions, but holding them loosely enough to let in the opinions of others. Um, it's a tall, yeah, it's a tall order because people have rebelled against that very thing, right? For their own reasons, and I think it has to start with beauty because I fully believe that is what unites all of us. And we have different ideas about what beauty means, but we like truth and goodness are they're outgrowths of beauty. They are if you start there, you you don't train intrinsically motivated people. You train people who can um who you can maybe mold into servants of that ideal, but you don't reach people at a fundamental level to say, oh wow, like I I agent want to devote my life to that. Um and the thing about beauty that is, well, beautiful but also fragile is that if you follow beauty, your ideas of what truth and goodness are will change. And ergo who you surround yourself with will change. Um, and too many people don't get the don't get the reality that that is actually in and of itself beautiful and not a sign of um, it's like the classic thing in a marriage. It's like your partner is going to change, but the second they do, you want to divorce them. um, and to stay in that is is yeah, I think it can only be done through things like rhetoric and things like literature because it's not rational. You can't argue that to someone. They what I just did personally was I went through this course with my poetics community on Yeats, and we read his entire life in a collected works from 21 to 69 or whenever he was about to pass. And we had all these really interesting discussions about like a lot of us really didn't like him as a man, for being obsessed with the same woman for his whole life, even after he got married to a different woman and like, asking out Maud Gonne's daughter after she rejected him and all these things that like were kind of repulsive and, some people found him really pretentious and annoying and all these things. But like we I think in and through that was an exercise on encountering otherness and the complexity of the fact that maybe we don't want to have a beer with him, but we find ourselves in love with his poetry. And something that a couple people mentioned that I found really fascinating, they were like, I consider myself on the left, but I find myself in love with poets who are on the right. And I actually don't like, I'm not speaking for myself now, I'm speaking for other people there. They're like, I don't like a lot of poets who are liberal. They're like, I don't particularly like, a Whitman or someone, but I love Ezra Pound, who was like a committed Nazi. Um, and it's like, what do you do with that? Do you just cancel the person? After you've had this encounter of like real, like genuine, you know, like love and beauty, it's like to cancel that person after that is to inadvertently cancel that part of you that was like drawn to that. And so yeah, it just made me think about a lot of things and what you were saying, but I'll pass it back. But yeah, something that I'm really interested in is like how do we recover that elite education for our times?
Well, I think beauty is a very big part of it. Elites based on beauty, or who is elite in making the Geopedia, who is elite, like elite based on creating an experience that inspires you to be more human. You could say there's a very big difference when Pierre Bourdieu in Distinctions is kind of talking about the elite. The idea is like, so the elite would use 15 different silverware and eat in this very complicated way, precisely so that the lower class is like, well, I don't want to do all that when I eat. And it actually creates a kind of effect that they deserve their elite status because when they eat, they have to do all these manners and it's this complicated affair and they have to every day wear this certain outfit. And the idea is that it created a certain distinction between the upper and the lower that made the lower actually accept the distinction because they would see all of the complicated things that the elites may do to just have a simple meal, right? Um, and the argument would actually be that if you have elites now wearing blue jeans and t-shirts and they're like, I'm just like you, that's actually begging for social upheaval because people are like, well, if you're just like me, why do you have so much money? That's not fair. And so there's an interesting idea that if you remove all of the distinctions between the classes to make them just like us, that actually greatly increases the likelihood of social upheaval. It's an interesting notion. But there's a very big difference between an elite education to keep out or to make people accept the status quo and an elite education to inspire people to be more human
Hmm.
or to be more beautiful. And I think that's the difference now. You need to think what is an elite education now is about inspiration, not barrier,
Yep.
or trying to justify the class distinction. Because again, if a lower class person sees the rich using 15 utensils to eat a meal, they go, well, I don't want to do that. Therefore, they should be elite while I am not. That's a kind of freezing the system. It's kind of freezing it up the way it is, right? Elite education now needs to serve inspire, ascent, the artistic creation, the unfolding of all things is new. This is especially the case in a unpredictable future with AI, where technological change will be so quickly we don't know what's going to occur. And elite education will make you prepared for the unexpected. It will make you able to work with whatever occurs, and so on and so forth. And I think it actually, at the heart of it, will be rhetoric, because rhetoric transforms subjectivity, and we will require a different form of subjectivity to handle an unpredictable future. So I think that's a big deal. Something else, and forgive me, this evening I will have to go in a little bit here for dinner, and
I was gonna ask when your
I
cutoff is.
apologize.
No, that is okay.
But a few more, and I'll give it back to you for any final thoughts, and we'll have to do this again soon. I think it's also just very important. The elites are still going to socialize, and if everyone else doesn't, and socialization is what creates success, et cetera, so forth, then the success inequality will only get worse. And I sometimes wonder if we should say success inequality versus wealth inequality, because, success, like socialization is how you are happy, how you meet new people, friends, you don't feel alone. And so, like socialization, the very interesting thing is that the elites understand that socializing is both how you get wealth inequality, is how you get wealth and actually success. That those things go together. Now, wealth and success can actually conflict if your wealth gets in the way of your relationships, but So the ability to socialize is actually at the heart of both. Now you have to also do more, take risk, and do other things, but socialization is really, really important. And again, if we don't learn how to handle socializing, I stress that the elite still will, and so the success inequality will only get worse. So it's very important to gain these capacities. Also, too, in elite education, we said earlier that there's no way you're going to be able to get in your body that you truly believe free speech is good unless you have encounters with other people that surprise you, that unveil the beautiful. And elite education is also necessary to get into your body that free speech is good because it is what increases the probability when you encounter other people, it's magnificent, or they say something that surprises you when you learn, right? So elite education is also necessary to make us actually genuinely want our freedoms. Like we say we want our freedoms, but we actually don't because when we get together with people, it's nerve wracking. And when other people speak, they say things that make us nervous. So we don't actually want our freedoms. We don't have an education that in our bodies make us want freedom. And so elite education is going to be part of that. And I think, yeah, the only way to do that is the beautiful. You have to experience the beauty of freedom. If you simply experience that freedom is good, or that, it's true that in hike, the more free people are, you get better emergent results. That's nice. That's true. I'm not going to do it though, because what's in it for me? I don't experience it as a good thing, exactly what you're saying with the teenager. And if you say, well, freedom is good, I don't experience it as good. I feel it is nerve wracking, right? So it has to be beautiful, or we're not going to keep freedom. We may legally have freedom, but we won't socially. And so that's that. So elite education and education in general, as such, like I basically think education must now be elite. Like education is elite in the sense of the creating of truly magnificent people of whom are capable of working in the beautiful. Otherwise, we're not going to want to keep our freedom. We'll say it, we'll
Mm.
say freedom's important, but in our body, we won't want it and we'll just isolate, we'll separate, and we won't do it anymore. So the stakes, I think, are very high. I think the loss of compulsory interaction, I think that's very astute. I think there are some things you can't understand the benefits of until you do them, and some things you can't understand until you look back on them retrospectively. And compulsive interaction is one of those things. Like when you're doing it, you're like, this is dumb. But later on, you go, wait, that actually trained my Oh, wait, that was training my nervous system. That was training my body to be able to handle uncomfortable situations or situations I didn't want to be in without blowing up or without retreating. Oh, that's really important because if I can't do that, I become a hikikomori. So that's a big deal. Also, I would like to note, I do wonder if the collapse of the nervous system is also part of the demographic crisis and why people aren't having babies. Because if they can't meet, or they can't handle the social, or their nervous system is not developing properly, that probably will translate into lower birth rates. That will probably look like kids not getting married or not getting married till later when it's harder to have children. And also, if people have kids, then they're probably just going to have one because they're going to be so overwhelmed by the nervous system hyperdrive of the single child. And then the other thing that happens when you have a kid is you find out everyone judges you on how you raise your kid, and you already weren't able to handle the social, and now you really can't handle it. So I would not be surprised if there is a weakening of the nervous system that is also contributing to demographic collapse. I do think those things are related. Um, I would just make a point. I really like what you, and then I'll give it to you for any final thoughts. There was more to say, but I also like what you were saying that we lack stages, church community, like stages to train the social. So no wonder we always have stage fright. The only way to get better, and I think this goes to what you were saying with the court and your experience. The only way to overcome stage fright is to get on stage. Like you have to get on stage and do it, and you get better and better, and you build up your immunity, your ability to handle it, right? Well, if you don't have a society of stages, funny enough, the weird thing that occurs is if you remove all of the stages, social stages like church community, it's not that stages go away, Everything becomes a stage, actually. That's the weird thing. It doesn't actually remove the stage. Now everything feels like a stage, because it actually always was. It just when you had those isolated stages, it was the revelation of what everything was in a contained way, so that you could handle it and trained in it. So when you get rid of stages, what it does is now you experience everything as a stage, because you're not able to tell the difference, and you're not able to approach things in a way that you control them. And so they overwhelm your nervous system. And so everyone just has a constant stage fright going on. I very much appreciate that metaphor. I will be using it. So I'm glad we had this conversation. I regret having to go, but let me give it to you, Michael, for any final things.
No, thank you for having me, and then this has been really lovely and just really generative and really juicy. The last thing I'll say, just to kind of riff on the stage idea, is I think in a world where everything is a stage, then actually the idea of a stage kind of becomes arbitrary, futile, because now that everything's a stage, it's like what isn't a stage then? Like what does it actually mean? And I think in that
Mm,
world, you stop being able to recognize the function of a stage,
yes. Mm,
or not just the function, but also um, the rules of a stage.
yes.
So, you know, I mean, what I'm about to say, I guess, may not technically be true in Shakespearean times, when like you literally have audience members like dragging, right, like actors like off the stage. Like if they didn't like them, you could just like remove them, and it felt existential. But now, like, delivering a bad acting performance, or forgetting your lines, or singing the wrong note in a concert, like it might feel, and you might get ridiculed for it on social media, it might feel existential, but like if you're able to tolerate that anxiety, you finish the set or whatever, and you realize, oh, I'm still alive, even though that was bad. Like it's not existential. And I think that's a function of the stage. It's like it's a training ground for
Yes.
you to practice these skills, but it's not going to have existential implications on your social standing, on like your character. It's practice. And people are going to have grace if you mess up. You're going to have coaches that can help you. But now that everything's a stage and also nothing's a stage, there isn't the bifurcation between the stage and like the real, the real world. And so you have people who feel like if they um go to the grocery store and they stutter over their words, that like I don't know what they think's going to happen to them, but like they build up this story in their head that like, or if I go up to the girl I like at school and I ask her out and she says no, all my friends are going to laugh at me and I'm going to be kicked out of the friend group, and all these things, which unfortunately that does happen. Um, but I think there's something really important about like the loss of, like, it's like we have the proliferation of video games, but it feels like all of our stages have lost the game, the function of it being a game.
Mm.
And I think, and I'll pass it back, or I'll leave. But like the last thing I'll say is, I think that goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, with this anxiety around speech.
Yep.
Because if you feel like everything has existential implications, like everything is life or death, that there are no stages, practice grounds, you can imagine the comic going out and practicing a set that they just created, and like, you hear comics all the time, they're like, yeah, you have to be comfortable bombing because that's how you learn and refine your craft. If we don't have those things anymore, then all of our like public and private arenas feel like the real thing. And if we say something that isn't a fully like fleshed out opinion or view or something that we're still kind of working through and someone doesn't like it, we could be doxxed for that.
Yeah.
And I think that is a really dangerous place to be. And so um, I'm all for stages, the Daniel Garner Elite School, um, uh, coming to a town near you. Um, but no, this has been really lovely.
Well, it is always
Thank you.
very well, thank you, and it is always lovely to speak with you. I completely agree with what you were saying. If we don't have stages, then we won't have stages of development. Maybe individually we'll develop, but we won't socially develop. It is very interesting to think that the stage plays a critical role. And I agree, the weird thing is if you remove stages, because basically all of what Juvenal would call the middle of society, the churches, the lion clubs, the bowling alleys. These are kind of stages to practice and to bomb and to get better at socializing. And if you don't have those, then it's not that the stage goes away, it's that everything feels like a stage. Well, it always feels like existential. It feels like, everything depends on every line you say, right? Because in a way, you don't have enough experiences where you encounter it didn't matter. You said something stupid during bowling practice and people got over it. They didn't hate you forever. You made a stupid comment at church and they were there next week. You don't have enough experiences of the restart, I suppose, of the fact that things making a mistake doesn't have to be final. Like I think people experience mistakes as final now. Like there's only fatal mistakes. There are no just mistakes. They're all fatal. Or it's very difficult to tell when it's which, and so you're nervous, and so you don't even since you don't know when mistakes could be fatal or not, because you don't have enough experiences on stages to have a discernment of that, you get tired of thinking about it and stay in your room. It's just not worth having to wrestle because what am I getting out of it? Why? I'm happy. I'm eating food and having fun in the apartment. I can watch Netflix or whatever. Again, they have a very good point, unless when they encounter the other, they experience beauty. Like, in a way, a reason why I think this is all important is because if the Hikikomori says to you, why come out of my room? And you haven't done the work to be beautiful, you have no response to them. So if you want the Hikikomori to come
Yes.
out of their room, if we want people to socialize, then it's on us to be beautiful, to create geopedia, to be inspiring. And if we're not going to do that, they have a great point. I mean, it's like, what else is out there than getting hurt or being misunderstood or people breaking your heart? If the Hikikomori says to you, all that happens when I go out here is people get upset with me. They don't care about me. They're angry. Like, why? Why go out of this room? And if you can't show them beauty, then they're going to shut the door.
Yep.
And they're not necessarily wrong to shut the door. And so I think the responsibility is on us. I think what's just very, very interesting too, yeah, and the anxiety around the Speech Act, psychoanalysis, Lacan, absolutely. The Speech Act is primary in this. What is very, very interesting is this kind of paradox where once you understand that all the world's a stage, as kind of Shakespeare put it, then there actually is the creation of stages to practice. And if you don't actually accept that all the world is a stage, then you nevertheless experience all the world as a stage. And you will ultimately experience it as just something that an idiot struts across, right? Because if one does not actually train, then you can end up in places you don't want to be, including where darkness is visible. But Michael, it is always a pleasure to speak with you, sir. Thank you so much, and may you have a wonderful evening.